When Daniel was born, I was grading final exams for a class on 19th century moral philosophy. I remember holding a red pen in one hand and his tiny squirming form in the other. He came 2 weeks early, right in the middle of a storm that knocked out the power at our house for 3 days. I swaddled him in my thesis blanket, the same one I used to nap under between lectures and committee meetings. That night, I whispered Aristotle to him between feedings, like lullabies carved in logic. I raised him in lecture halls and library corners, in staff lounges filled with chalk dust and coffee-stained journals. He colored in the margins of my old textbooks and learned to count using pages from the Republic. For years, we were each other's constants. When his father walked out, Daniel was 6. I was 44 and freshly tenured. I told myself I could hold both roles, mother and scholar, and somehow I did, or I thought I did. But nothing prepares you for the silence that follows when a child stops looking at you with trust and starts seeing you as an inconvenience. It was a Friday afternoon, unusually warm for October, the kind of golden air that made the leaves outside my apartment glow like stained glass. I had just pulled a homemade casserole from the oven, chicken with rosemary and lemon, and packed it into the ceramic dish Daniel once made in high school pottery. It was crooked and lopsided, glazed in an uneven gray-blue. I'd kept it for over 2 decades. He and Kate were moving into their new home that day, a 2-story in a gated neighborhood across town. I wasn't asked to help with the move, I wasn't invited to the housewarming. But I thought, maybe if I just showed up with food it would open a door, if not into their house, then at least into their rhythm again. I wore my brown corduroy coat, the same one I'd had since the year of Daniel's graduation. The collar was slightly frayed, the pockets deep with time. I walked the 2 blocks to the bus stop, casserole wrapped in a dish towel, and rode across town, with the dish warming my lap. No one spoke to me on the ride. I didn't mind. I stepped onto the porch slowly, casserole in hand, and rang the bell. When I arrived, the house looked like something from a catalog. White exterior, clean black trim, manicured lawn, still catching sunlight like it was staged for a photo. Moving boxes were stacked near the front door, and laughter echoed from the backyard. I could hear Kate's voice before I saw her. The door opened after a moment. Daniel stood there in a navy shirt and jeans, his hair wind-mussed, cheeks flushed. But he didn't smile. He blinked, as if calculating something. "I brought dinner," I replied, holding up the dish. "Something warm, so you wouldn't have to cook after the move." He looked over his shoulder. I couldn't tell if he was searching for support or an excuse. "Mom," he said flatly. "That's all right. More the merrier. Kate's folks are inside," he said. "They brought food too." There was a beat. A kind of pause I'd only ever heard from students about to ask for deadline extensions. Then he cleared his throat and said, "Mom, maybe it's better if you don't come in." I tilted my head slightly, not because I didn't understand. I did, but because I wanted to be sure he'd say it out loud. He did. "It's just this new house. It's a fresh start for Kate and me. We want to build something, our own. You know? No offense." The ceramic dish felt heavier than it had minutes before. "No offense," I repeated, not asking, just echoing. He hesitated, but didn't correct himself. "It's not about you. It's just, we're trying to set boundaries. You understand, right?" I adjusted the dish in my arms. "Of course. Hi, Linda," she said. "Thanks so much for coming. But yeah, we're sort of mid-unpacking chaos right now." Kate appeared behind him, smiling the way people do when they want to move things along, without seeming unkind. Daniel didn't bend down to take it. He didn't hug me. He just put a hand to the back of his neck and said, "Thanks, Mom." I nodded. "Of course," I said again. My voice sounded very far away. "I'll just leave this here, then." I placed the dish on the front step. I turned and stepped off the porch. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the trimmed lawn. I didn't look back. The bus ride home felt longer. The casserole dish sat on the step like an offering to a door that would never open again. When I reached my apartment, I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the wall. My bookshelves lined one side, full of Plato, Rawls, Beauvoir, and dozens of other names that once felt like anchors. But they didn't offer answers now. I thought of the empty lot next to their house, the one I'd noticed on the real estate site when they first sent me the listing months ago. It was small, but charming. No trees, just a patch of open soil and possibility. It was still on the market. I opened my laptop. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I typed the address into the property search bar. There it was, still available. Price lowered. Since August. I clicked the listing. The photos were sparse. A sun-drenched rectangle of dirt and grass, a little uneven at the edges. But I saw it clearly. I saw a porch with ivy creeping up the side, a small mailbox with my name carved in brass, a reading nook near the window, and a garden. Not out of revenge, not even defiance, just space that was mine, where I wasn't treated like a guest in a life I helped build. It wasn't impulsive. I know that's what Daniel and Kate would assume if they ever found out, that I bought the land next to their new house out of bitterness or pride. But the truth is, it came from somewhere deeper, quieter, a place where old disappointments live. Not rage, not even defiance, just reclamation. I spent the weekend combing through files I hadn't touched in years, retirement statements, tenure paperwork, the severance from the university when they nudged me toward honorary emeritus status. I'd saved most of it, lived modestly, never took trips I couldn't afford, never bought what I didn't need. I didn't have much, but I had enough. Enough to make a statement that couldn't be silenced with a closed door. On Monday, I called the listing agent. Her name was Melanie, young, bright-voiced, and full of the kind of energy I used to mistake for capability when I was still mentoring students. "You're interested in the lot on Highland Ridge?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "the one adjacent to number 40. There was a pause. "That one's been sitting a while. I think most people want a bit more space or more distance from neighbors, but it's a solid lot." "I'm not most people," I replied. She laughed politely. "Well, if you're paying cash, we could close fast." I was. We did. By Friday, I held the paperwork in my hand. No fuss, no fanfare, just a signature and a deed and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had chosen proximity not to provoke, but to exist, to remain. The parcel itself wasn't much to look at. Dirt, tufts of stubborn grass, an orange construction flag still fluttering from the previous owner's survey, but it was mine, and I stood at its edge, that afternoon, just past the property line from Daniel and Kate's White Palace, and let the fall breeze wrap around my coat like a question finally answered. Kate saw me that day. She was on the porch, watering a fern that didn't need watering. Her eyes caught mine, no wave, no nod, just a pause, then the slow, practiced turn of someone rehearsing polite indifference. Daniel never appeared. I didn't mind. I had other things to do. That night, I sat at my desk, the same one I used to write lectures on cant and civic duty, and began drafting the first sketches of my new home. I didn't need much. 2 bedrooms, one for guests I may or may not ever have, a kitchen large enough for baking, a small library wall, and a porch that faced west. I wanted sunlight. I wanted silence. I wanted choice. The next morning, I reached out to an old student of mine, Gwyn Torres. She was a sophomore when I first met her, awkward and curious with a quiet brilliance she hadn't yet trusted. Now she was a licensed architect in Durham, with her own firm. "You're serious?" she asked, once I explained. "Completely. And you want it modern," she clarified. "Not colonial, or craftsman. I want it clean," I said. "Timeless, something that doesn't apologize for taking up space." She was quiet for a beat, then said, "That sounds like you." We set a time to meet the following week. In the meantime, I took a notebook and made a list, not of materials or dimensions, but of intentions. Things I wanted this house to hold. Not just furniture, but purpose. A chair by the window, where I could drink coffee at sunrise. Shelves low enough for a child to reach, if ever one visited. A back door that opened to soil. Real, honest ground I could plant things in. No one had asked what I wanted in years. It felt strange to answer it myself. Midweek, I returned to the lot with a folding chair and a thermos. I sat at the back corner, feet in the dirt, and imagined it all. Not as revenge, but as renewal. I listened to the wind move through the trees and watched a squirrel bury something near the edge of the yard. Eventually, I heard voices, Kate on her phone. "She's just sitting there," she said, a few yards away, but not whispering. "No, I'm not joking. It's like she's camping, with a notebook. No, I don't know why. Daniel hasn't said anything. He's just ignoring it. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. I kept writing. Later that evening, I received a message. Daniel. Hey Mom, heard you bought the lot next to us. Didn't expect that. Hope everything's okay. That was it. No questions, no curiosity, just polite surveillance dressed as concern. I didn't reply. Instead, I highlighted the line in my notes that said, leave space for things to grow that aren't visible yet. The ground was soft from recent rain when I met Gwen on the lot. She pulled up in a compact black SUV, the kind with a child seat in the back and crushed leaves caught in the windshield wipers. I brought a folder with my notes, hand-drawn sketches, and the printed deed. She came with a tablet, a tape measure, and a smile that looked genuinely curious, not the polite sort I had grown used to receiving. This is beautiful, she said, stepping out, surveying the modest rectangle of land like it held some hidden potential. I gave a short laugh. That's generous. No, I mean it, she said, adjusting the scarf around her neck. There's something really raw about it. You can still hear the wind in the grass. She knelt near the rear boundary line, then glanced toward the neighboring house, Daniel's. The blinds were drawn on the second floor. I wondered if they were watching. I didn't tell them, I said quietly. I didn't say I was doing this. You don't owe them that, Gwen replied, without looking up. This is yours. I said nothing, but I tucked that sentence into my chest like a warmer kind of stone. We walked the edges of the lot together. I pointed where I imagined the front porch would go, where the garden might start. Gwen took photos, notes, nodded thoughtfully. She asked me things no one had asked in years. Where I liked to drink my morning coffee, if I preferred Western light or Eastern quiet, whether I wanted to hear rain on the roof or wind through the windows. Let's design for permanence, she said. Something grounded. I liked that. Grounded. We shook hands before she left. Her grip was steady. I'll send you a few initial renders in a week or two, she said. And if you're open to it, I'd like to bring in a friend of mine. Female contractor. Owns her firm. Honest. Direct. That would be fine. Also, Gwen added with a faint smile, she doesn't underestimate older women. You'd be surprised how rare that is. No, I said. I wouldn't. She drove off in a flurry of gravel. I stayed behind. That night, I didn't sleep much, not from worry, but from ideas. My mind, long dormant from academic sabbaticals and quiet evenings, was alive with questions of tile, insulation, orientation. The language of construction was different from philosophy, but it had its own elegance. Walls forming arguments, windows like thesis statements, hallways of quiet rebuttals. By morning, I had a list of books to borrow from the library. Not just on architecture, but on native plants, soundproofing, and energy-efficient materials. I wanted this home to outlast me, not because anyone would inherit it, but because permanence, I had learned, didn't always require lineage. I rode the bus to the local library, just as I had when Daniel was young. I passed our old stop, the one near his elementary school. It was strange how a place could hold memory like muscle, contracting at the sight of a familiar bench, a cracked sidewalk, a lamppost we once tied a balloon to. At the library, the librarian recognized me. You're back, she said, adjusting her reading glasses. It's been a while. I'm starting something new, I replied. She smiled. Those are the best reasons to read. I left with 5 books and a schedule for 2 community classes, sustainable home design and small space gardening. The following week passed in tasks, signing paperwork, setting appointments, researching soil composition. Gwen's designs arrived on Tuesday. She'd sent 3 variations. All were modest, but each held a different tone. One was angular and modern, another soft-edged, with rounded corners and wide eaves. The third was quiet, almost reverent, low-pitched roof, wide porch, a sunroom facing west. That one felt like me. I sent her my choice and added one note, include a fireplace, not because I need it, but because every home should have a place for warmth. The response came an hour later. Done. And I'm bringing the contractor by on Friday. Her name's Rochelle. That Friday morning, I stood at the edge of the lot, boots sinking slightly into the softened soil, when a white truck pulled in behind me. Rochelle climbed out. She was in her early 50s, broad-shouldered with sun-darkened skin, and short, practical hair. Her handshake was firm. Her questions, sharper than Gwen's. But I liked that. She asked about drainage, foundation preferences, insulation plans. I answered every one. Not because I knew the answers, but because I was ready to learn. At one point, as Rochelle walked the perimeter with a measuring tape, Kate stepped out of her front door. She held a mug in one hand, phone in the other, dressed in workout clothes like she hadn't noticed the frost on the grass. Our eyes met. I nodded, briefly. She said nothing, just watched. Rochelle glanced her way and said, "Neighbor?" In a manner of speaking. She doesn't look pleased. I didn't build it for her, I replied. Rochelle smirked. Good. After she left, I lingered. I walked the property again, slowly, picturing the walls rising. I imagined paint drying on a quiet Sunday, the scent of wood and plaster settling into place. I imagined sitting at a kitchen table that faced no one's judgment but mine. I looked again at their house, clean, bright, uniform. The lawn too perfect, the windows too high. I wondered if they'd ever built anything with their hands, anything that had to be earned, nail by nail. I doubted it, but that was their story to live. I had just begun mine. By the end of November, the foundation had been poured. Concrete lines cut across the earth, like deliberate sentences, each slab and footing a statement of intent. I stood at the perimeter, watching Rochelle's crew as they checked measurements and reinforced the framing. Men moved in coordinated silence, their breath forming little clouds in the cold morning air. There was something deeply satisfying about it all, a kind of music in the repetition of labor. Tools clinked, boards creaked, a radio played softly from inside the truck. It reminded me of office hours, students drifting in and out, each with questions and notebooks, all adding their voice to something larger than themselves. I brought hot coffee in a thermos that day, not just for me, but for Rochelle and the crew. I had labeled each paper cup with a black marker, plain, sweet, extra cream. No one refused. Rochelle took hers with a nod and a quiet, "Thanks, Doc." "Don't call me that," I said. "I'm retired." She chuckled. Still earned it. She and I had settled into a rhythm. She didn't coddle, didn't over-explain, and respected when I asked for clarity. Our working relationship had structure, boundaries, and mutual precision. I appreciated that. By contrast, my interactions with Daniel and Kate had narrowed into a kind of non-existence. A few days earlier, I'd spotted Daniel across the yard, dragging trash bins to the curb. His eyes landed on the rising framework behind me. The new beams had just gone up, forming the vague outline of walls and doorways. The lot was no longer abstract. It was becoming real, imposing. Even. He didn't wave. I didn't expect him to. He stared for a beat, then turned back toward his garage and closed the door a little harder than necessary. The silence between us was no longer passive. It had texture, weight, a kind of brittle edge that even the wind seemed to carry. That afternoon, Rochelle approached with a clipboard and a question about flooring options. She offered engineered wood or reclaimed pine. I asked for both samples, wanting to feel the grain in my hands. While she went to the truck to retrieve them, I wandered into what would soon be the living room. There was no roof yet, no walls, just sky and timber and frost-kissed dirt. But standing there, I could already sense the shape of things. The morning sun touched the back edge of the slab. My future fireplace would be there. Across from it, a modest wall of built-in shelves for books. I envisioned the armchair I'd place by the window, the one I hadn't bought yet. Maybe blue, something soft, with good bone. I traced a fingertip along one of the vertical studs. There had been a time in my life when everything was made of ideas. I'd lived in hypotheticals, taught arguments and analogies. This was different. This was matter. Tangible, stubborn, resistant to debate. That night, Gwen emailed new elevation drawings along with a suggestion for a porch swing. "Optional, but highly recommended," she wrote. I replied, "Only if it faces west." The next few weeks followed a pace I hadn't known in years. Framing, electrical walkthroughs, insulation quotes. I started keeping a spiral notebook in my coat pocket to jot down decisions, paint finishes, cabinet heights, lighting angles. At night, I would cross-reference product specs with consumer reports, a habit I hadn't lost since my peer review days. One morning, while reviewing light fixtures on my laptop, I received a message from an unfamiliar number. Hi Linda, it's Kate. I know things have been tense, but Daniel and I were wondering if you'd like to come by this weekend. We're hosting a small holiday thing, just neighbors and his coworkers. Thought it might be nice to reconnect. There was no warmth in it, just careful phrasing. It didn't take long to realize what this was. They were losing their narrative. What had once been a distant curiosity, my name on a deed, my presence at a property line, was now a visible structure. I wasn't simply orbiting their life anymore. I had built my own, and people noticed. Construction trucks parked between our lots. The crew laughed. Kids from the neighborhood stopped by to ask what the house would look like when finished. More than once, I caught Kate watching from her front window, eyes narrowed behind her designer frames. I didn't respond to her message. Instead, I visited the local nursery. It was too early to plant anything, but I wanted to walk the rows. The quiet of that place, bare branches, potted soil, and the smell of wet cedar calmed me in a way I hadn't expected. The young man working the desk looked surprised when I asked about native perennials. "Planning for spring already?" he asked.
I'm planning for permanence.
I said. I bought nothing, but I left with a list. On the way home, I passed the community center and noticed a flyer taped to the glass door. Senior voices, local stories from women over 60, open mic and art showcase. December. I tore the tab with the contact info and tucked it into my coat pocket. I wasn't sure if I'd read something aloud, but I liked that the space existed. That someone, somewhere, still cared about the shape of a woman's life after 60. Later that day, I walked the lot alone again. The framework was more defined now. Doorways clear, trusses overhead like ribs arching toward a future I could nearly touch. For a moment, I closed my eyes and imagined the house completed, light through curtains. The hum of a kettle, the creak of wood underfoot. Not perfect, just mine. I didn't go to their holiday party. I didn't reply to Kate's message. I didn't pretend to consider it. I didn't hover in my doorway, wondering if forgiveness needed to be draped in twinkling lights and forced pleasantries. I stayed home, if you could call 4 plywood walls and a foundation home, and I watched as strangers parked their cars in a line along the curb outside my son's house. I sat on a folding camp chair by the edge of the lot, bundled in my long corduroy coat, a thermos of black tea beside me. I watched guests arrive with their hands full, wine bottles in velvet bags, pie dishes under foil, a toddler wobbling in reindeer slippers, laughter spilled from the porch. Music echoed faintly from inside, the kind of curated playlist meant to imply effortless joy. Someone might have thought I was spying, but I wasn't watching them. I was watching the house. Not theirs, mine, or what would become mine. The skeletal frame had grown bones since last week. Windows now framed views that weren't even glassed in yet. Roof panels leaned patiently in place, and the outline of the chimney had begun. The crew had left early that day, holiday weekend and all, but they'd made real progress. Rochelle had walked me through it earlier, showing where the kitchen would open to the dining space, how the hallway would angle just slightly to give the bedroom more privacy. She asked if I wanted the front door to face directly across from my son's. I said no. "Angle it 10 degrees, I told her. "Just enough to look west." "Symbolic?" she asked, pen hovering. "No," I answered. "Practical. The sun sets that way." Now I sat alone, surrounded by the quiet scaffolding of new beginnings, and listened to the gentle chaos coming from next door. Around 8 o'clock, a breeze picked up and carried the smell of cinnamon and cloves from their chimney toward me. I closed my eyes. For a brief moment, it reminded me of years past, of Christmases when Daniel was still small, when I strung popcorn garlands with clumsy fingers while he napped on my lap, of laughter that didn't come with disclaimers or distance. It was tempting to lean into that memory, but nostalgia can be a clever saboteur. It softens things that were never soft. I opened my eyes again and saw them. Daniel had stepped onto the porch with a drink in hand, sleeves rolled up, face flushed from warmth or wine. He stood at the railing, scanning the street. And then he saw me. He didn't wave. He didn't call out. But he saw me. And in that long moment of eye contact, fleeting, taut, fragile, I saw a flicker of something he couldn't hide quickly enough. Shame. Kate appeared beside him, seconds later. She followed his gaze, then looked directly at me. She whispered something, her hand on his arm. He nodded. set his drink down, and went inside. The door closed softly behind them. I remained where I was. Later that night, after the cars had gone and their porch light clicked off, I walked the frame of my house again. It was dark now, but I knew the layout by heart. I moved carefully between rooms that did not yet exist, stepping over joists and ducking under beams. I stood in the spot where my fireplace would live and imagined it lit, quiet flames licking brick. The silence around me was full, but not empty. I thought about calling him, about inviting him to see what I was building, about saying, "You don't have to approve, but you should understand it." But I didn't. I had spent too much of my life explaining myself. Let the house speak. The next morning, I found a package leaning against the inside of the frame, wrapped in plain brown paper, no note. Inside was a set of wind chimes. Metal, copper-colored, handcrafted, with glass accents the color of sea foam. There was no name, but I knew. It wasn't Daniel's style. It wasn't Rochelle or Gwen, and it certainly wasn't from Kate. I hung them on a nail protruding from a beam near the future porch, unsure if they'd hold. When the wind picked up an hour later, they sang. Not loudly, not bright, just a low, wandering tone, like memory threaded through steel. I left them there. That week, work slowed for winter. Rochelle's crew came in shorter shifts, focusing on sealing the roof and wrapping the structure for weather. I brought coffee each morning, sometimes muffins from the cafe 2 blocks over. They accepted them with gruff gratitude. One day, while waiting for Rochelle to finish reviewing a delivery manifest, I sat again in my usual chair, now positioned directly in what would be the living room window. Daniel came out to walk their dog, a golden retriever with too much energy and not enough leash. He didn't see me right away. The dog did. It pulled toward me, tail wagging like a child who hadn't learned caution. I didn't stand. I just offered my hand. The dog sniffed, licked, and sat beside me like we had history. Daniel caught up seconds later. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "She's still learning." I looked up. "She's very polite." "She usually isn't." We both stared ahead for a moment, the silence again full of everything we weren't saying. He gestured vaguely at the framework behind me. "You've made a lot of progress." "Yes," I said. "It's coming along." Another pause. "Do you need anything?" he asked. I turned slightly in my chair, just enough to meet his eyes. "Do you mean that as a question, Daniel, or a confession?" His face colored. He opened his mouth, closed it. "I hope it turns out how you want," he said finally. "It already has," I replied. He nodded, pulled on the leash, and the dog stood reluctantly. I watched them walk away, the leash taut, the distance measured not just in feet, but in choices. The house became real the moment the front door arrived. It wasn't attached yet, just leaning carefully against the frame, still unpainted, its grain raw and full of character. Rochelle had texted me that morning. "Door's here. You'll want to see it before we mount it." So I bundled up early and walked down, breath clouding in the air, boots crunching on frozen mud. It was solid oak, heavy, with a rectangular glass panel offset near the top, designed to let in light, but preserve privacy. I had picked it from a catalog without ceremony, but seeing it in person, it felt like a threshold in every sense. I ran my fingers down the edge. It was cool and smooth, but already I could imagine it warmed by sun, touched by years. Gwen had designed a small overhang above it, so that even rain would knock more gently before entering. I liked that. "Still want the brushed brass hardware?" Rochelle asked, unfolding a blueprint beside me. "Yes," I said, "and the mail slot." She raised an eyebrow. "That's a little old school." "I'm a little old school." We shared a faint smile, then moved on to discussing the porch column finish and whether we should stain the floorboards or leave them natural. Practical decisions, things I had control over. In the background, the wind chimes tinkled softly, still swaying from the beam where I'd left them. They'd begun to rust slightly at the bottom, but I hadn't moved them. Something about their worn presence made the space feel lived in, even before a single wall was finished. Later that day, I brought out my notebook and sketched a rough diagram of the living room furniture layout. A chair angled toward the fireplace, a shelf on the far wall. I even added a rug, though I didn't yet know what color it would be. Just that I'd want one, something that felt soft under bare feet and didn't match the curtains. I spent over an hour like that, pacing slowly from room to room, imagining it all. That's when I noticed her. Kate was in her backyard, a few feet from the shared boundary line. Her back was to me at first. She was pouring something into the soil, perhaps compost. When she turned and caught my eye, she stiffened slightly, but didn't look away. I didn't either. For a long moment, we simply stood in parallel yards, a silent standoff of civility and strain. The construction around me continued. Someone hammered a beam into place. Another worker measured the base of a window frame. But none of it broke the tension between us. Kate spoke first. "It's coming along." Her voice was careful, not hostile, not warm, observational. "Yes," I said, "it is." She nodded slowly. "I didn't think you'd actually build it." "That makes two of us." Another pause. Wind fluttered through the trees behind her. The sun cast both our shadows on the frosted lawn between us. Mine tall and angular against the boards, hers swallowed by the bare fence. "I suppose it's good," she added, "that you're close by. For Daniel. For if anything ever happens." I studied her then. Not as a daughter-in-law, not as the woman who'd drawn a boundary I never asked for, but as a person negotiating her own quiet guilt. "I didn't build it for proximity," I replied. "I built it for presence." She blinked at that, visibly unsure whether to respond. "I should get back," she murmured, retreating toward her back door. I didn't stop her. That evening, Rochelle and her crew worked late. They were sealing the windows in before the next week's cold snap. I brought them tea in paper cups and offered slices of the cranberry loaf I'd baked the night before. "You're spoiling us," one of them said, grinning. "No," I replied, "just feeding the hands that build futures." By sundown, only Rochelle remained. She was packing her tools when I asked her something I hadn't dared to before. "Have you ever built your own home?" She looked up, surprised by the shift in tone. "No," she said, "too busy building everyone else's. Maybe one day." I nodded, then gestured to the structure around us. "Thank you for making this feel like more than lumber and expense." She placed a gloved hand on the front door, leaning nearby. "This is going to outlast all of us. That's the point, right?" It was. After she left, I stayed. The sun had nearly dipped behind the rooftops. My breath came out in steady clouds. I stood in the entryway, where the door would soon hang, and imagined stepping through it, for the first time, arms full of groceries, wind in my hair, a kettle already waiting to boil. No one would greet me, no one needed to. The house would hold its own welcome. I picked up my chalk and marked the inside of the frame above where the door would mount. 3 words. "You are here," not as a warning. As a confirmation. The drywall went up in mid-January. It happened over 3 steady days, each one colder than the last. Rochelle's crew worked quickly, their boots tracking snowmelt and sawdust across the subfloor. The house began to feel heavier, not with burden, but with definition. Each space I had sketched was no longer imagined. Rooms now held air, and air began to hold silence. I stood in the bedroom doorway late one afternoon, coat buttoned to my chin, watching 2 workers smooth the seams with wide metal trowels. I could see the outline of the built-in shelves Gwen had designed near the bed, and the small recess we'd added beside the window for a reading chair. It would be quiet there in the mornings. I'd face the street, but not the traffic, just enough distance to feel part of a world without being pulled by it. Rochelle walked in, holding a clipboard. She nodded toward the wall where a small rectangular opening had been framed at chest height. "That's the niche for your husband's photograph, right?" I nodded. We hadn't talked much about him. Not because of sorrow, I had processed most of that years ago, but because some names didn't need to echo through every room to be remembered. "Yes," I said, "it's where his watch will go, too. And a small plant. Something green, even in winter." She smiled faintly and noted something on the sheet. "You want a light fixture above it? Low watt?" "No," I said. "Let it live in shadow sometimes." He never liked being the center of attention. Rochelle chuckled once, softly. Then she was off again, barking measurements to the hallway team. By that evening, the insulation was hidden, the beams wrapped in white, and my steps began to echo against the walls. The house felt different. Less like an idea, more like a conclusion being written in clear paragraphs. I brought a folding chair into what would be the study, set it down beside the narrow window, and sat, notebook open, pen in hand. No writing came, only thoughts. Shapes of sentences, the edges of things I might say one day if asked how I built something out of absence. Across the lot, Daniel's lights flickered on, room by room. The holiday decorations were gone now, packed into plastic bins, likely stacked in their garage with everything else not meant for daily display. I hadn't spoken to him since the dog incident. No new messages, no invitations. But there was something calmer about the space between us now. The tension had become ambient, less like threat, more like weather, still present, still shifting. That weekend, Gwen arrived with printed mock-ups of the kitchen cabinetry. "You've officially chosen more tile samples than any client I've had," she said, handing me a folder thick with swatches. "I spent 30 years grading people's ideas," I replied. "You think I wouldn't obsess over backsplash grout?" We sat on the porch steps, still temporary plywood, for almost an hour, discussing counter depths and drawer configurations. Gwen always brought snacks in her bag. That day, it was candied pecans and 2 wrapped granola bars. "Do you ever think about what happens after it's done?" she asked at one point. "I try not to," I said. She raised an eyebrow. "I've never built a future I wasn't expected to share with someone else. This is the first time the end point doesn't require a next step." Gwen didn't fill the silence with a platitude. She nodded and handed me a pencil to circle my tile preference. The next week, Daniel knocked on my plywood door. It was dusk. I'd just returned from the hardware store with a tote bag full of curtain rods and a ceramic knob I didn't need. The knock was soft, tentative. I opened the temporary barrier and found him standing in a coat too light for the cold. "Hi," he said. "Hello." He looked past me, at the half-installed kitchen. "You've done a lot," he said. "Yes." He shifted his weight. "Kate thinks we should invite you for dinner once you're settled." I met his eyes. "Do you think that?" He hesitated. "I think. I didn't handle things well. Back then, you said, 'Don't come to our new house.' That's not poor handling, that's clear direction." He swallowed. "I was trying to set boundaries. And now you've discovered that lines go both ways." He nodded once. Not defensive, just receiving it. I didn't ask him inside. There was nowhere to sit yet, and he wasn't ready to stay. But before he left, he said something low, barely above the wind. "I never thought you'd actually do it." "I did. I see that." Then, he was gone. I stood with my hand on the doorframe long after he disappeared across the lawn. The wind caught the chimes again. This time, they sounded like affirmation. The light fixtures arrived on a Tuesday. I had picked them out weeks earlier. Simple, warm-toned sconces for the hallway and pendant lights with frosted glass for the kitchen. No ornate metals. No unnecessary flourishes. I didn't want the house to whisper luxury. I wanted it to say welcome and to mean it. Rochelle was already there when I arrived, kneeling in the kitchen, wiring the pendant mount over the island. "You could have waited for the crew," I said, pulling off my gloves. She looked up, grinning. "And missed the chance to see how these turn out." Not a chance. I set my tote bag on the counter, still wrapped in cardboard, and pulled out 2 cinnamon muffins from the bakery on Main. We'd fallen into a rhythm. I brought something warm in the morning. She stayed late double-checking details most contractors wouldn't bother with. She took a muffin, murmured thanks, and went back to her work. The house was warmer now, inside and out. The insulation had been sealed, the HVAC humming gently even through the temporary vents. The walls were painted a soft oat color Gwen had called linen dusk, and I liked the way it shifted with the time of day. Cool in the morning, golden by afternoon. I wandered into the living room, while Rochelle adjusted the mounting screws. Sunlight poured in from the west-facing windows. I could see the garden beds I'd planned along the fence line, still empty but marked with stakes and string. In a few months, they'd hold rosemary, wild iris, and purple coneflowers. By the front door, the brass hardware had been installed. I ran my fingers across the cool surface of the lock, then opened the door just slightly to feel the outside air. Across the yard, Daniel was standing beside his garage, holding a box. He noticed me, gave a small nod. I returned it, just once, and closed the door gently behind me. We hadn't spoken since his apology, but he'd left a bag of groceries on my porch the following weekend. Apples, bread, a small jar of honey, and a note written in Daniel's careful print. No expectations. I hadn't replied, but I hadn't thrown it away either. Back inside, Rochelle was examining the beam above the hallway, eyeing the spot where the ceiling light would sit. "You're putting a lot of heart into this place," she said as I approached. "That's the only part I trust not to rot." She didn't laugh, but her expression softened. "You ever miss teaching?" I considered it. Sometimes, but I don't miss the meetings, or the committee work, or the way my voice had to be twice as calm just to be heard. She nodded, as if she understood. "You've still got that professor energy," she said. "Like you're always grading something silently." "Old habits," I replied, "but now I only evaluate wiring diagrams and floor plans." We finished that day, around 4. I stayed behind to sweep up debris and dust, though no one asked me to. I wanted the floors clear, not spotless, just intentional. I moved room to room, broom in hand, stopping now and then to admire the corners. Gwen had curved slightly, or the narrow ledge we'd built into the laundry nook for my tea tins. Every detail had a reason. I had made sure of it. When I entered the second bedroom, the one I wasn't sure I'd ever use, I noticed something odd: a folded blanket laid across the built-in bench, a cushion still in its plastic wrapping beside it. I hadn't put them there. Neither had Rochelle. On top of the cushion sat a small white card. I opened it. "In case someone visits, or stays." No name, but I knew. Daniel. I sat down slowly, the broom resting against the wall, and read the card again. It was the first time he'd acknowledged that this house might not only be for solitude, that someone might knock one day, that I might answer, that he might. I stayed there for a while, sunlight fading around me, the room settling into early evening quiet. The floor creaked faintly as the air cooled. The walls, once blank blueprints, now held something heavier than structure. They held permission, not from anyone else, from me. There's a particular sound that only comes when you're moving furniture for the first time into a place meant entirely for you. It isn't loud, but it's distinct, a mixture of floor groan, soft breath, and the brief silence that follows when you set something down and know it will stay there. Rochelle and her crew finished the last of the electrical work on Thursday. The lights were operational, outlets passed inspection, and the thermostat blinked steadily on the wall like a quiet metronome. Gwen stopped by with a bottle of sparkling cider and a bouquet of eucalyptus. "You did it," she said, handing me the bottle. "No fanfare, but a finished home." "Nearly finished," I replied. "I still have to fill it." "Well," she added, glancing around, "it already feels full." She was right, in a way. The walls no longer echoed. The house held the subtle weight of decision, intentional lines, honest materials, no wasted corners. Still, I hadn't brought in a single piece of furniture yet. Until today. My new sofa arrived in the early afternoon, delivered by 2 men who barely spoke except to confirm where I wanted it. I pointed to the western wall, between the bookshelves, and beneath the main window. They set it down gently, adjusted it once, and then were gone. I stood over it for several minutes, just observing. The sofa was deep blue, soft velvet, low-backed with simple wooden legs. I'd chosen it not for how it would look in photos, but for how it would feel under a tired spine, with a blanket draped over one side. It was the first brand-new sofa I'd ever owned. Everything before had been shared. Marital compromise, hand-me-downs, or functional pieces that belonged to a phase I was always about to grow out of. I sat down slowly. The cushions exhaled under my weight. I pressed my palms against the armrests. I breathed, and then I cried. Not in a loud, cinematic way. Just a quiet release, tears that came not from sadness, but from a loosening of something long held. I sat there for what felt like hours, not thinking, not evaluating, simply existing. By evening, I'd unpacked my lamp from its old box, the one with the tiny crack in the base I never got around to fixing. I placed it beside the sofa and turned it on. The light was soft, amber. It gave the room its first real glow. Later, I moved my chair into the study. The same wooden armchair I'd used in my office during my final decade of teaching. Gwen had recommended a new one, but I couldn't let go of this one. The arms bore the faint worn patches from lectures rewritten too many times, and the cushions still bore the subtle imprint of afternoons spent thinking too hard about students I'd never see again. I placed it beside the window, where the light from the north would land, without glare. I set my journal on the small ledge we'd built beside it and leaned the chair back by 2 degrees. Just in around 7, I heard footsteps across the lawn. I knew who it was before I stood. I opened the door before he knocked. Daniel stood on the porch, holding a ceramic dish covered with foil. "I made lasagna," he said. "You made it?" I asked. He hesitated. "Kate helped." But I stirred. I smiled, stepped aside. "Come in." He paused at the threshold. "It smells like new paint and eucalyptus," he said. "Better than mildew and obligation," I replied. He laughed, genuinely, this time, and stepped inside. We didn't sit right away. He looked around, taking in the bookshelf, the still boxed lamp by the front hall, the folded quilt on the bench beneath the window. "It suits you," he said. "I made sure of that." He nodded, set the lasagna on the counter. "I saw the sofa get delivered," he admitted, "from the upstairs window." "Spying?" "Observing," he corrected, like a child trying to please the teacher. I offered him tea, and he accepted. We sat, not across from each other but side by side on the new sofa. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I sipped quietly. After a long pause, he said, "Kate's worried we were too hard on you." "You were," I said. He didn't flinch, just nodded. "I don't think she knew what it meant," he added. "The way we shut that door." "It wasn't just the door," I said. "It was the unspoken invitation to disappear." He turned slightly, eyes damp. "I didn't expect you to build a whole life next door." "I didn't build it to challenge yours," I said. "I built it to reclaim mine." We sat with that truth for a moment. Then, as if something inside him relaxed, he leaned back against the cushion. "It's a good sofa," he murmured. I had forgotten how a porch changes things. Not the structure itself. It was modest, just a 6-foot stretch of timber decking and 2 square columns, but the space it offered, a porch, is both invitation and retreat, neither fully inside nor entirely exposed. It is where you wait without urgency, where you watch the world pass, not needing to follow it. On the morning the swing was installed, I brewed coffee and waited inside, listening to the muted clinks of Rochelle's crew bolting it to the beams. I had picked a bench-style swing, cedar, unfinished, hung from sturdy chains. Gwen had suggested a coat of weatherproofing, but I declined. I wanted the wood to age naturally, to gray with the seasons, to speak in creaks and wear. When the last bolt was tightened, Rochelle came to the door. "Test it before I leave," she said. "Make sure it doesn't pitch." I stepped outside, mug in hand, the air still sharp with February cold. The sun had just cleared the neighboring rooftops, spilling long angles of light across the frost-glazed railing. I lowered myself gently onto the swing and let it sway, slowly, as if the house itself had exhaled. "It's perfect," I said. She gave a small nod. "That's it then. I'll send the final invoice next week." I turned toward her, watching as she stood at the bottom of the steps, her clipboard tucked under one arm, her usual sharp tone softer now. "You've built something real here," she added. "So? Have you?" We stood in the quiet for a few moments, no need to fill it with small talk. Then she tipped her head and turned toward her truck, boots crunching on gravel. I stayed seated, hands curled around the mug, letting the swing move gently with the breeze. That afternoon, I hung a wind bell from the corner of the porch, not the old chimes from construction days, those I'd taken down and stored. This was a new one, ceramic, navy blue with a soft tone that reminded me of distant train whistles from childhood. It didn't sing as often, but when it did, the sound was round, full, a kind of echo of thought. That evening, Daniel came by again. Not with food this time, not with apologies, just himself. He stood at the base of the porch steps, hands in the pockets of his coat, gaze traveling up to the swing, to the ceramic bell, to the house he now recognized as complete. "Looks different," he said. "It is different. Feels more like you." I gestured to the empty end of the swing. "Sit, if you'd like." He climbed the steps slowly, as if unsure he was allowed. When he lowered himself beside me, the swing shifted slightly, finding its balance. "Kate's at her mother's," he said after a while. "Took the dog." "Storm coming?" I asked. "Maybe, but I think she just needed air." We let that rest between us. I sipped my coffee, reheated, now lukewarm. He looked out toward the street. "She says you building this house changed everything." I didn't realize she was so fragile. She's not. But it reminded her that not everything revolves around her version of family. I raised an eyebrow. And what's your version? He didn't answer at first. Then, I'm still figuring that out. The swing moved gently beneath us, its chains sighing with the wind. I watched a squirrel dart along the fence line, then disappear behind the neighbor's shed. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head bowed. Can I ask you something? You just did? He smiled, faintly. Did you ever think I wouldn't come back around? I tried not to make predictions, I said. That was part of the pain. Not knowing if silence meant distance or if it meant permanence. He nodded. I didn't realize how far I'd gone. You didn't have to go far, just had to close a door. He looked at me then, eyes not defensive, just open. I'd like to earn my way back in. You don't need to. This house isn't about earning anything. Then, what's it about? Return, I said, to myself, to stillness. Maybe even to the idea that not all doors need to stay closed. We sat until the porch light flickered on automatically, casting a soft circle around our feet. He stood first. Thanks for the seat, he said. Any time. As he walked back across the yard, the wind picked up, catching the ceramic bell just enough to let it sound once low and round and certain. I stayed on the swing, watching the light in his house blink on. He moved past a window, a shadow within walls that had once denied me. Now he moved differently. Not around me, but toward. The first time I cooked a full dinner, in the new house, I did it without checking the clock. Not because I lost track of time, but because I no longer owed it to anyone else. The roast had just come out of the oven, resting on the stovetop, while the vegetables finished in the pan. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and garlic, and the window near the sink was fogged slightly with steam. Outside, the sky had turned a pale shade of lilac, the kind that only comes after a clear winter day. I set the table deliberately. 2 place settings. Not because I expected company, but because the act itself felt like a conversation. The plates were mismatched on purpose. One ceramic with a blue edge, the other ivory with a faded floral ring. My napkins were cloth frayed at the corners from years of use, folded cleanly beside the forks. I lit a candle, not for ambiance, but for acknowledgement. The flame flickered gently, reflected in the window pane across from me, like a signal fire with no distress. As I poured myself a glass of water, I heard the soft crunch of footsteps outside, slow, hesitant. A knock followed. 3 short taps. Then nothing. I opened the door to find Kate standing there, bundled in a gray coat and gloves, her cheeks tinged pink from the cold. Her hands clutched something wrapped in a linen towel. I wasn't sure if I should come, she said. I didn't speak right away. My hand rested on the edge of the door, not blocking, not welcoming, just waiting. She held out the bundle. It's just bread. I baked this morning, I had extra. I stepped aside. She walked in slowly, her gaze flicking over the room, the swing behind her still swaying slightly from the motion of the door, the framed photo of Gerald above the shelf, the 2 plates already set. You were expecting someone? She asked. No, I said, but I was open to the idea. Kate placed the bread gently on the counter. I unwrapped it, warm still, crusted golden, studded with rosemary. We stood in the silence that people who've known each other too long sometimes carry. Not hostile, just heavy with all the things never said. I haven't seen the inside, she murmured. You're standing in it. She almost smiled. Her eyes landed on the built-in bench under the window. Daniel told me you designed this place yourself. With help. It suits you. I think so. We sat at the table, the candle between us. I didn't move the second place setting. She didn't ask if she should leave. Over the next hour, we spoke more than we had in a year. She told me about her mother's declining memory, about how Daniel had started helping with the finances, but only recently asked her opinion. She admitted, almost sheepishly, that she resented being the one to keep their household from unraveling while also being the one blamed for its tension. You saw me as a threat, I said plainly. She didn't deny it. I saw you as permanence, she said. And I didn't know how to fit into that. We ate in intervals, silences filled with the sound of forks and the occasional refill of water. There were no raised voices, no apologies forced into neat boxes, just the slow, difficult work of 2 women unpacking a shared life from opposite ends. By dessert, just slices of apple and a dusting of cinnamon. We had moved to the swing. The sky had gone indigo, and the wind bell made one soft note as the air shifted. Kate looked up. "You'll grow things here," she said. "I can feel it." "I already have," I replied. She stood after a while. "I should head back." I walked her to the steps. She paused at the bottom, glancing once toward her house, its windows warm in the dark. "Thank you for setting 2 plates," she said. "You're welcome." After she disappeared into the quiet beyond the fence, I returned inside. The table was still set, candle low now, flickering in its final inches. I cleared the dishes, washed each one by hand. No rush. No need to preserve the moment. It had already happened. Before I went to bed, I folded the second napkin and placed it in the drawer. Some dinners are meant for more than one, even if only one returns. I planted the rosemary on the first warm day of March, not because the frost was fully gone. Everyone in town knew better than to trust early warmth, but because it was time. The dirt had loosened just enough, and the air, while still crisp, no longer carried the metallic edge of winter. I knelt in the garden bed beside the porch, gloved hands digging into the soil I'd spent the last few weeks preparing. I worked slowly, steady in motion, careful not to overthink placement. It wasn't a grand space, just a narrow plot bordered with stone, but I had designed it with memory in mind. Every herb, every bloom, had a reason. Rosemary first, for remembrance. Then lavender, not far from the swing, for calm. And beside the step, a small sprig of thyme I'd rooted from a cutting last fall, for patience. I had considered vegetables, but I didn't need the burden of harvests. I wasn't here to prove productivity. I wanted scent, texture, a living palate to greet me each morning. As I worked, the wind bell chimed above me, slow and hollow, like a breath released. I looked up once to see Daniel watching from across the fence. He didn't wave, he didn't intrude, but he stayed longer than usual before returning inside. Later that afternoon, I set out a tin watering can and filled it from the tap in the kitchen. The porch swing creaked softly behind me. As I stepped onto the path, everything I did that day moved in rhythm. Pour, pause, press, pat, the same kind of rhythm I'd once taught in seminar rooms, when logic was a tempo and clarity was a victory. When I finished, I stood, brushing soil from my knees, and looked at what I'd created. Small things, humble, nothing manicured, but alive. I went inside, washed my hands in the sink, and left the window open. For the rest of the evening, the scent of earth lingered in the kitchen. That night, a letter arrived. Hand-delivered, tucked into the slot on my door. I knew the handwriting before I unfolded it. "Daniel. Mom, Kate wants to invite you over next Sunday. Just a quiet brunch. No expectations. She asked me to say she meant what she said the other night. Also, Dylan's coming. We told him about the house. He said he'd like to see it, if that's okay with you. We understand if you'd rather not. Just let us know. Dylan, my grandson, 17, nearly a man, with the same stubborn crease in his brow his father had at that age. I hadn't seen him since the graduation party, the one where I'd brought him a rare book on astronomy, and he'd nodded politely while Kate explained that he's more into video games now. I sat at the kitchen table with the letter for a long time. It wasn't an invitation I'd been waiting for, but it was one I couldn't ignore. I opened my journal and wrote one line. Some things need sunlight to grow. Others need witness. Then I folded the letter back into thirds and placed it between the pages. The next morning, I swept the porch. The breeze had pulled down a few brittle leaves during the night. I moved carefully around the flower bed, avoiding the new roots. The rosemary looked firm. Already, it leaned slightly toward the light. As I turned to head back inside, I heard the latch on the gate click open. Dylan, taller than I remembered, shoulders still narrow but promising breadth. He wore a faded sweatshirt and carried a paper bag. I brought pastries, he said, lifting it slightly. Did they come with conversation? Not guaranteed, he replied, but smiled. I stepped aside. He climbed the steps in 2 bounds and sat on the swing like it was already familiar. I joined him. He opened the bag, pulled out 2 croissants, one plain, one chocolate, and handed me the latter without asking. He remembered. Or maybe someone told him. Either way, it mattered. We ate quietly, the breeze rolling through the porch slats. After a while, he gestured toward the garden bed. Dad said, "You planted herbs." I did. Why not flowers? Flowers bloom and vanish. Herbs stay useful, even when quiet. He nodded. Like that meant something to him. "Do you like it here?" he asked. "I like who I am here." He tilted his head. "Is that different from who you were before?" "Yes," I said. "Not worse, not better, just full." He looked around. "It's peaceful. I built it that way." He pointed toward the rosemary. "Is that the memory one?" "Yes. I read about that." "You're reading again?" "Sometimes." We stayed on the swing until the sun rose higher and the porch grew too bright. Before he left, he turned back at the gate. "Thanks for the chocolate croissant," I called. He smirked. "It's the least I could do." You built a whole house. It wasn't the brunch that marked the shift. It was what happened after. Daniel and Kate's house looked the same that Sunday morning, gleaming windows, clean lines, the kind of curated comfort that often masked complexity. I brought a tin of shortbread cookies, wrapped in a linen towel, and a small vase of lavender from my windowsill. I didn't know whether I was being polite or symbolic. Maybe both. Dylan met me at the door, which opened before I could even knock. He stepped aside, gave me a look that didn't need translation. It said, "You belong here," in a way I hadn't heard from anyone in a long time. Inside, the table was set neatly. Mimosas, scones, quiche warm in a ceramic dish. I recognized from a Christmas past. Kate wore a pale green blouse. Daniel looked tired, but relieved, like someone who'd finished a long, hard letter and wasn't sure how the reader would respond. It was fine. That was enough. But the shift didn't happen at the table. It didn't happen during Kate's apology, softly offered while clearing plates, or during Daniel's quiet confession. How he realized too late that he hadn't just shut a door, but locked it behind him. No, the moment came later, after the dishes were done, after the teacups were emptied, after Dylan offered to walk me home. The shift came as I stepped onto my own porch and heard the house speak back. Not in words, of course, but in the way the floorboards welcomed the weight of my return. In the way the rosemary reached a little more toward the sun, in the swing's faint creak as it caught the wind. This house, unlike theirs, didn't owe me an apology. It hadn't abandoned or reshaped itself to suit anyone else's narrative. It had risen, nail by nail, in response to something I thought I'd lost for good: my voice. That evening I sat at my desk in the study, the old chair creaking beneath me, just as it had for decades. I pulled out a new journal, its spine stiff, pages untouched. I hadn't kept a real one since my previous notebooks had become more task-oriented: paint samples, delivery dates, quotes from the electrician. This one felt different. Ready for story, not structure. I wrote, "This is the sound of something unbroken, quiet, rooted, and unfinished on purpose." I closed the book and let it rest on the table. Tomorrow I'd visit the local library. They had a community reading series on Thursdays. Voices from the Porch, it was called. I didn't know if I would sign up. I didn't need a microphone. I already had a house that listened. Around 9, there was another knock. Daniel stood there, this time without pretense. No dish in hand, no request, just the look of someone who had more to say but didn't want to say it in front of the wrong people. "I can't sleep," he admitted. "Come in," I said. He didn't sit. He walked the length of the living room, instead, eyes trailing across the bookshelves, the window casting its shadow on the wall. "I thought this would hurt to see," he said, "but it doesn't." I waited. "I think I was afraid," he added, "that you'd build a life without us and not look back." I stood still in the kitchen doorway. "I didn't build it to turn away, Daniel. I built it so I wouldn't have to keep knocking where I wasn't wanted." He sat then, finally. Not on the sofa this time, but in the armchair beside the window, the one with the worn arms and the slight tilt backward, the one he'd once sat in at the university while waiting for me to finish office hours, twirling a pen between his fingers and mouthing the lyrics of songs he couldn't play in lecture halls. He didn't speak for a long time. Eventually, I poured us both tea, rooibos, unsweet. We drank in silence, but it wasn't empty. It had tone, depth, like a room with good acoustics where every word spoken, or not, could land and linger. Before he left, Daniel touched the doorframe. "You named it yet?" The house? I asked. He nodded. I haven't, but I know what it is. What's that? An answer. He looked puzzled, but only for a moment. Then he smiled. I think I get it. When he was gone, I stepped out onto the porch. The air had cooled, but not sharply. I could smell the thyme at the edge of the bed and a faint trace of soap from the laundry line. Across the yard, their lights were still on, but dimmer now. Dylan's window glowed faintly, the curtain half drawn. A new swing, metal, store-bought, had been added to their porch. Likely, a gift. Likely, his idea. I sat on mine, letting the chains settle around me. I didn't rock. I didn't sip tea. I just listened to the creak, to the breath of the garden, to the way night always arrives quietly in places you've made room for it. The wind bell sang once, then stopped.